All right. Welcome back to my channel. I'm Miguel Benitez, and I am on a search for goodness, truth, and beauty. And this channel allows you to join me on that journey. And so today I have Dr. Josh Herring with me. He is one of the other Faulkner University contributors to this volume on Disney and apologetics. So this is actually, yes, I have mine as well. So we're happy to finally have it in our hands. It was a long process there, but we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So here, Josh holds a PhD in humanities from Faulkner University. He currently serves as professor of classical education at Thales College for Thales Academy. He works with teachers to deliver a classical education to the highest possible degree of excellence. He hosts the Optimistic Curmudgeon podcast and writes frequently for the Acton Institute, Law and Liberty, Public Discourse, and a variety of other outlets. Josh and his wife Jennifer live in North Carolina with their 4 cats, many trees, and infinite bookshelves. All right, so Josh, thanks for taking the time to join me on the channel.
Appreciate you inviting me on, Miguel. I am so excited to get to chat about this book. It's so great to finally hold this thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I was so excited for this. So this is episode 2 for those of you who are watching. This is episode 2 of the series. I got to interview Dr. Zak Schmoll in the first one. He's a contributor, and so Josh is my second guest on this. And yeah, we talked about it. And for me, this was a kind of professional bucket list item. So I've grown up a huge fan of the Disney franchise. I was born in mid to late 80s, and so I grew up during what they call the Disney Renaissance, and so these movies were movies I loved and were formative for me, and so I've always wanted to do something that kind of marries my academic interests with this love for Disney that I have. And so I was really happy to be able to do this. So tell us a little bit about you. What has your kind of upbringing been in relation to the Disney franchise? Were you a fan, or were the movies not really your thing? How has that been for you?
No, Miguel, when I look back, I was born in 88, so just the tail end of the 80s. And I remember growing up in a small town in Tennessee, and I think I saw Aladdin in the theater in Clarksville, Tennessee. And I remember when The Lion King came out. Funny thing, I remember my mom had a chicken in the oven while we were watching Snow White as a family, and we all got so engrossed in Snow White. I'm sure my parents had to have seen it before, but we kids were totally fascinated. So much so that all of us forgot the chicken. That our dog had a great burnt chicken for dinner that night.
Nice.
So I really grew up with those movies. I've always had a particular love for The Lion King, and that's the one I ended up writing about. And I've followed The Lion King through original, special edition, Broadway, Lion King 1.5, Lion King 2. Just spoiler alert for anybody, but they get progressively worse. The original is the best. I was not a fan of the live action. It just did not do it for me.
Right.
I like my talking anthropomorphized animals to be cartoons. Just something is lost when you make them real.
Yeah.
But they really, first and foremost, I think Disney was my introduction to just really good stories. When I got into teaching, we had a pretty strict video policy at Thales Academy. We still do, just in case anybody's curious, but we still do, where videos have to be approved. But one of the 2 that were approved my first year, that there were 3 movies at a classical school that were Disney that we probably all of us showed way too many times. The Sword and the Stone, Robin Hood, because both Arthur and Robin Hood were taught in 7th grade.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Hercules, because you can point out all the classical allusions throughout Hercules.
Sure.
They were clean, they were good fun, and they were reasonable representations of the tradition. So I thought there's a really good parallel there. And so I've always, kind of like you, I don't know that I ever had a formalized academic bucket list, but when I saw the call for papers, I was like, this idea that had been rattling around in my head for a couple of years, it's like, oh, this is it. This is my excuse to finally write that paper. And I pitched it, and Man, I was thrilled that I think there's what, 6 Faulkner people in this book.
Yeah,
Like
I think
we're
there was
all
6
over
of
this
us.
thing.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think there might be something to that, just the kind of people that would be drawn to Faulkner's program are also, I think, the kind of people that, um, to greater or lesser degrees are going to be interested in engaging the Disney stories in one way or another, and so, yeah, I think that's really telling. And what's neat is out of the 6, I think one of it's either 6 or 7 of us, and one of them is actually a professor at Faulkner. So it's just interesting that there was that much interest in the project. Yeah, and so that was actually my second question. Did you pick Lion King to write about because it was your favorite or one of your favorites growing up, or what kind of led to that choice in particular?
Well, most of my writing projects, I don't know if you do this, but I think a lot of folks do who teach and write. Like a lot of my writing projects grow out of the classroom, and at different times, that's more true, especially when I've been trying to work out some idea in the classroom, and then I sort of polish it up into some essay. This my essay was one of those. If I remember the timeline correctly, I think I was teaching 11th grade philosophy for the second time. The first time I taught that class, I had just fallen head over heels in love with the writings of Soren Kierkegaard. And I was really intrigued by existentialism. And the way I taught that to my students was by teaching Kierkegaard, and then we would read Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, and then an essay, a cutting basically from his longer work, Either or. And then we would watch The Lion King, and then we would have a Socratic seminar about where we saw the elements of Kierkegaard in The Lion King. So when this came around, and I was kind of like, oh, this would be a great place to bring together some analysis and take all of these quotes that I've already found, because that's, of course, one of the hardest parts of
Right.
writing and research. I've already found the quotes. It's just a matter of stitching them together and then kind of doing a reading of the Lion King through those quotations. And I already kind of had the outline in mind even as I pitched it, because
Yeah.
I had already kind of worked this out with my students. So it's funny as I read when I go back and reread this thing. I mean, there are paragraphs I'm like, I have a certain student in mind with that paragraph.
That's cool. That's really cool. Yeah, and so we've alluded to it a couple of times, and for those who aren't familiar, sometimes these kinds of projects can take a very long time. I was actually looking back because I had to put some of the documents together. You know, it's uh, publishing and stuff part of the promotion process at my
Sure.
job and things like that, right? And so I'm putting documents together. So I went back to look and see when we submitted this, the initial kind of, and I'm not even sure, but I want to say it was 2019 at some point. I think it was
Hmm.
early 2019 is when the initial call for papers,
Okay.
and then I think we got confirmation in like late 2019.
That sounds right.
And then COVID hit and the whole world stopped for a little while, and then we had issues in the process. We switched
Right.
publishers, all of that, and so long process. Um, and then what's particularly interesting about the amount of time that passed in this project is that some really eye-catching, newsworthy issues arose with Disney, right? And kind of I think it put us in an interesting situation because
Mhm.
I think that at least some of us, and I'm certainly not speaking for all the authors in the volume. I don't personally know all the authors in the volume, so I'm not.
Sure.
But we were at least disappointed in some of the ways that things were playing out
Mhm.
with the Disney franchise and have been playing out since. And so I even had some people ask me, like, because they're first hearing about this project. Sure, we've been working on it for 2 years, right? But
Right.
they're first hearing about the project as Disney's kind of in the headlines for other things. And so they were asking me, like, why would you take on this project? Or why did you think that this was worthwhile? And so I wanted to make some space for you to address that as well. How do you feel considering that maybe Disney has gone in some directions that you
Oh,
wouldn't agree with, contributing to this volume on Disney Works?
Well, I guess first and foremost, it does make me cognizant of the need to be very charitable to other people who have maybe contributed stuff to volumes. It makes me a little bit more aware that I've been very spoiled growing up as a writer in the internet era, and I'm used to 6 weeks being a slow turnaround time for an article. When, as you just narrated, 4 years is not improbable for a book project that involves 20 something people and God alone knows how many publishers who had to sign off on this thing. And so there's that. As far as particularly Disney, I'm still not at all. I don't in any way regret this. I still think it is entirely worthwhile. Our subtitle ended up as exploring the moral power and theological significance of Disney stories. I really like that famous line from Abraham Kuyper that every square inch belongs to Jesus Christ.
Right.
And I think that that means that everything that's true in a Disney story, everything that really resonates with us, or really, I rephrase that, Disney stories resonate with us because there is truth in them. And it is still of great value to kind of go through and look at those stories, figure out what's true. Now, I think the unfortunate part is that the Disney Corporation made a bit of a bet. I think they started hedging their bet when they started losing a ton of money about 2 quarters ago from our current recording.
Right.
They brought, I think it's Bob Iger is their current CEO. They brought him back. The previous guy, Bob Iger, he's no conservative by any stretch of the imagination.
Right.
But he does have a much greater attention to the bottom line. His predecessor, whose name escapes me, was a bit of a, I don't think I'm too unfair to call him a social justice warrior as a CEO. I mean, he was ready to campaign for Disney to be about advancing minority voices and different sexualities. And he was very overt about that. I mean, that all came to a head in the battle against Ron DeSantis with the parental rights and education bill. And Disney changed their tune in one sense. Now, you can certainly be very critical of Disney, and you could see a lot of this early on where most of the parents in Disney stories are pretty terrible people.
Sure.
The kindness of Geppetto is the exception. The foolish father is a pretty common trope and so on. But Disney kind of threw in against parents and in favor of LGBTQ radicalism. And that just poses a huge problem. Like I would not be publicly trying to associate my name with Disney today in that same way. Right. 2019, 2018, I was like, no, this is great. They're just telling stories, and their market success is really showing the connection between their stories and reality. But I think Disney has been trading on that in order to advance certain political agendas that are really antithetical to good storytelling. So in that sense, I just that's really all I have to say about it. I mean, I just think it matters as part of the, if assuming we have any listeners, we as those of us who contributed to this volume, it does belong to us to be aware of the history of the volume.
That's right.
These articles very much reflect a 2018, 2019, 2020 authorship, right, but they're published in 2023, and that's slightly significant for just recognizing, for anybody doing kind of Disney historical scholarship. I don't know if that's a real thing, but that kind of scholarship would need to take that situation into account.
Yeah, and worth mentioning, and I know Jeremy, our editor, who put a ton of work into this volume, has made it clear on the website and those sorts of things. This is an independent volume. This isn't associated with Disney in any way. We're using their stories and looking at them from a kind of academic way, a kind of cultural apologetics type way. And so yeah, just a reminder of that. Most of the stories that we engage with are of the older variety, and I think you raise a good point, and this is something Zach and I discussed briefly. Christianity in America in particular and Disney have kind of had a strange relationship throughout the years anyway. So the SBC and Disney have had, their issues. And it's interesting because, so I wrote on the Disney princesses, right?
Oh, okay.
So, and I largely take a more kind of positive view, but there's certainly concerns to raise regarding the princesses and some of the kind of common tropes that can be seen throughout the Disney movies. And so, but I thought there was real value in those stories too, and so I try to highlight that. And so, yeah, so I think like everything, there's nuanced approaches, and I think that's what we were trying to do. Though it's worth acknowledging, things have really changed from the time that we started the volume to
I
today.
guess funny you mentioned the SBC boycott, because that too is that's a childhood memory of mine. I'm dyed in the wool Southern Baptist. It's theologically impossible to be born a Southern Baptist, but it's pretty culturally normal.
Right, right,
I was
right.
one of those, and I own it by faith and conviction now. But I remember as a kid, my parents talking about Richard Land declaring as president of the ERLC that all good Southern Baptists were going to boycott Disney. And I don't think she had it beforehand. I'm pretty sure my mom commemorated that event by going to Walmart and buying a giant Minnie Mouse one-piece bathing suit. that was how we boycotted Disney in our
Right.
house.
Yeah. All right. So let's go ahead and turn to your chapter then. So first, you do write your chapter on Lion King, on Simba in particular, but you use Kierkegaard, and so for maybe those who are watching, they're interested in Disney, they're interested in cultural apologetics, but maybe not familiar with Kierkegaard. Can you just briefly, clue us in on who Kierkegaard is?
Sure. Kierkegaard is a fascinating figure, and I think the first thing anybody needs to say when talking about him is just a recognition that he is very confusing, and intentionally so. One of the difficult things about Kierkegaardian scholarship is that every time Kierkegaard wrote a book, and he wrote upwards of 16 volumes that are each discrete books that are addressed in different contexts and different audiences, he writes them under a different pseudonym. So, and it's a matter of endless debate amongst Kierkegaardians about whether or not they truly is it really right to say Kierkegaard thinks, or should you always preface it with the pseudonym? John the Silent thinks, Smith the something thinks, and obviously Kierkegaard is behind it all, but he never directly tells us what he believes, because his philosophical method, I love teaching this to students because we focused on the so direct philosophers like Plato, who sets up a clear antithesis, or Hegel, who uses thesis, antithesis, and synthesis as his methodology. And then you get Kierkegaard, he's the philosopher of the winding trail. He's going to take you on the circuitous journey, and you never really know where you're going or what it's going to be like or what the payoff is going to be. And then you suddenly realize you're standing on the top of a mountain and you can see this whole view that you didn't realize was even there before. And reading him changes you. At least that was my experience.
Yeah.
And I found he helped me understand faith in a totally different way. Historically, he's a 19th century Danishman. He has a fun romantic story about him where as a young adult, 18, 19, 20, somewhere in there, he was engaged to a lovely redheaded girl in Copenhagen, but he was struck with this epiphany that he could either have a nice family life or he could be a philosopher. And he promptly dumped Regina Olsen and became a philosopher. And he's sort of the very romantic philosopher. He lived in a time period where public national Lutheran Christianity was the norm in Denmark, but very few people actually had real faith. And this became the piece of Kierkegaard that at least has most infused the stuff of his that I've read, where he's really concerned about the fact that people could go to church, stand and sit and kneel and fold hands, all without believing in the miraculous. These are good 19th century scientific Danes who are really interested in this interesting idea of Darwinian natural selection and aren't bothered at all by, and don't really believe that Jesus was born of a virgin and rose from the dead and that the Christian faith is real. And Kierkegaard and his philosophy, and I'll close my soapbox moment with this, but Kierkegaard and his philosophy lays out basically this challenge to say it would be far better to be an authentic atheist who truly recognizes that he's an atheist than to be an atheist and not know it. So in that sense, Kierkegaard is one of the first people to really press past a public veneer of Christianity and say, whether you say you're a Christian or not, what's really at stake is yourself. And this is where he argues that your ultimate personal task is one of self-formation. And it's all about making yourself. And if you want to know more of what I think about Kierkegaard, you got to read the chapter. So it's all
good.
kind of
Yeah, no, that dovetails well into your chapter, right? And so you take a look at you take a look at a series of decisions that Simba has to make, but you say that there's this major decision that Simba has to make. And that's what kind of gives shape to your chapter. And I thought, and I don't mean to maybe highlight a point that maybe you just mentioned in passing, but at least as a Disney fan who's thinking through these stories that I've loved so much, and enjoying to see what observations authors are making about these movies that I love, right? You said something, and I'd never thought about it this way, but you said that Simba's deciding between being like Mufasa or being like Scar. And I think in a sense, the being like Mufasa is the obvious one, but I had never considered that Simba in his more immature self, and you quote a passage from the I Can't Wait to Be King song. If he becomes who he sings about in that song, he's becoming Scar. He's not becoming Mufasa. And I don't know, for me, that was kind of an exciting insight that I hadn't considered before.
Miguel, it's so much fun to actually talk with somebody who's read this chapter, because you know what it's like to write something and you send it out and you never know what actually hits people or if anybody sees the connections you're seeing. I'm glad that one landed. It does seem to me such a clear contrast between monarchical figures, because you've clearly got both. Scar is going to be a single ruler and Mufasa is a single ruler. There's no democracy in The Lion King. It's about a monarchy. But you've got such contrasting visions. There's Mufasa, who rules in accordance with the circle of life, and he's ruling in the best interest of his subjects, and he really is their king, and he is for their good. But then there's Scar, who rules for his own pleasure, and he's really, I think, the image of a tyrant. So you here almost get this Aristotelian comparison of a positive and negative single rule vision. And at the beginning of the song, I mean, that's all Simba can see, is the fact that no one can tell the king no.
Right.
I just can't wait to be king. I would say, everybody go right, everybody go left, everybody do this, everybody do that. And what 10-year-old hasn't wanted that kind of power?
Sure, right.
But honestly, I think part of all of us growing up is realizing that honestly, we're not made for that kind of power. That kind of power belongs to God alone. Right. And something goes wrong if we don't have checks and balances in our lives. We would honestly, probably most of us would seek unhealthy things. And the more power we have as we seek unhealthy things, the more we end up harming those around us, which is exactly what I didn't really trace Scar's character, but that's exactly what you see in Scar. Right. I mean, I think that's part of what's going on in the depiction of the Pride Lands as this, and going this great contrast from a lush oasis in the desert to a almost black and white drawing. Yeah. There's no more light. There's no more greenery. There's tumbleweeds. There's skeletons. All the vitality is gone, because what vitality there is being used to serve Scar's appetites. It's not being used to create the flourishing for everybody.
That's right. Excellent. So I really appreciated that. And in a sense, then I'm looking at the movie now, and like, we're being presented with these two figures, and Simba is having to make choices, and those choices are going to lead him in one of these two directions. And so I just thought that was really interesting. I enjoyed the insight. So now you chose to, and the title of your chapter is a Kierkegaardian reading of The Lion King, Simba Becomes a Person. So looking at Simba, we've alluded to, him having to make major decisions, perhaps the biggest decision coming as, is he a Mufasa or is he a Scar? Why did you think Kierkegaard, or looking at it through a Kierkegaardian lens, would be a helpful way of approaching this?
I think in part because Kierkegaard gives us a different way to think about personhood I mean, there's the obvious Christian way to think about personhood. Every human being is a person made in the image of God. And I don't mean to denigrate that in any way by saying that's kind of the obvious approach, but that's sort of that's where most of us would really begin. We're thinking about persons. Kierkegaard doesn't start there. He instead, I'm going to read two sentences. This is from page 427. This is part of the quote. This is from Either Or. Kierkegaard says, for a person to live ethically, it is necessary that he becomes conscious of himself so thoroughly that no accidental element escapes him. The ethical does not want to wipe out this concretion, but sees in it its task, sees the material with which it is to build and that which it builds. Kierkegaard has this sort of image, and he's so poetic. That's why you got to read him very carefully and imaginatively. You have to trust him as your guide when you're reading Kierkegaard. But he, in multiple places, he writes about the person as sort of this vaporous, ephemeral, ghosty, jello thing. I know I just mixed my metaphors, but that's kind of what Kierkegaard's doing. And that word concretion is really key, because that's what Kierkegaard sees as the task. If you can imagine yourself as sort of ephemeral and vaporous, but you need to become concrete, you need to become stable, you need to become firm, you become a self. And in that becoming a self is really what Kierkegaard sees as the process of adulthood. Now, one of the reasons I was so attracted to this model is that this becomes helpful kind of in the conclusion, but I've grown into teaching at Thales Academy, which is not a Christian school. And I've had a lot of times over the years where we will hit key passages in literature or key examples in history class, or I'll be teaching ethics, and we'll get to a clear moral conversation. And I don't have the tools of God said it, therefore we do it. That's that right. I can appeal to if I'm preaching or if I'm teaching at church. I'm doing a Bible study right now in Deuteronomy. Moses has no problem saying, God said it back there at Mount Horeb, right. Therefore we do it, lest we be kicked out of the land. I can't quite do that in a secular context in the same way.
Right.
And Kierkegaard helps me reframe the ethical question so that I can look at my students and say, okay, let's reset the conversation. It's not so much about, did you do the right thing? Did you do the wrong thing? It's really about what kind of person are you becoming? Because this is another piece of Kierkegaard's theory of a person. We're always becoming a person. That's just the question, are you becoming Tony Soprano? Are you becoming the guy, Walt in Breaking Bad? Are you becoming Cruella de Vil? Or are you becoming someone that you actually want to be? And if we can define who you want to be, then we're better able to consciously choose that, or at least recognize those moments of choice. And that's in a very real sense what I think it gives an access to a different understanding of ethics. And I love Kierkegaard's vision of the ethical as really being all about self-formation. And that's what education is all about.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I couldn't help but think of my own chapter as you're talking about the becoming, right? The title of my chapter is The Pretty Princess, Disney's Theology of Becoming Beautiful. And so it's the similar kind of this process that's unfolding in the decisions that we're making. That's really interesting. And so we talked about it beforehand, so I'm just cluing in the audience here. I told Josh to give us enough, but I want people to read the chapter. So I appreciate what you've shared, but I want to make sure to point people to the chapter because I think it is well worth their while to read. Again, I'm a big fan of the project. I certainly haven't read all the chapters yet, but I'm working my way through them as I'm able. And I have really come to appreciate just a lot of the work that's been put into it. So as a contributor, what do you hope that your readers will gain from reading your essay, maybe the project at large? You know, what are you hoping somebody walks away with as they engage with this work?
Oh, man. For starters, this is more about your previous comment than your direct question, but I'll come to your question in a second. Yeah. For all that we talked about the publication history of this volume, it ended up at the right place. We ended up with Moral Apologetics Press and Highbridge Books, and they were able to produce this volume at $21.99
That's right.
a piece, which, just in case any of our audience is not aware, academic publishing is an incredible scam. If we had published this through a mainstream academic imprint, this volume would have been about $120 a piece. And it would not be the kind of thing that you could hand to a high school student who loves Disney movies, or a film student who is interested in looking at maybe one of our analyses for a research paper or something. But instead, this book is. So that's honestly one of the things I was really grateful for about that whole process, that it ended up at a place that I can send this link to my family and say, hey guys, I'm in a book and you can buy this one. Yeah. Not like, please sell a kidney and then you can get my book. Like, that's just.
It's so interesting that you bring that up. I not only submitted for this one, but also for a work on the theology of Tolkien. And I basically worked on both at the same time. And they ended up getting published around the same time. Yep. And so, but that one is with the original publisher that we were working with. And yeah, the volume is $90. Yep. It's half the size of this duology. And yeah, no, unfortunately, I don't even get it at a price where I can, get it to my friends and family,
Oh, sure.
So it's, I'm really glad where it did end up. And certainly in that sense, and I think that's why I'm excited to tell people about the chapters that are in it, because it is at a affordable cost. Yeah. And so people can really get their hands on it. So, yeah.
I mean, and one of the things I love doing, I finished the degree, so I can technically say I have some minor achievement in scholarship at this point. But whatever my career ends up looking like, I hope it's someone that uses gifts of academic scholarship for the public at large.
That's right.
I mean, I think this volume itself is an attempt in that direction to say, hey, there is some value in thinking carefully about the media we consume. Here's an attempt at doing that. To your actual question a minute ago, like what do I want people to get from this? I hope that this is a chapter that does what I think good literary criticism ought always to do, where you've read the original, then you read the critic, and when you go back to the original artifact of criticism, you see something new in that thing. I mean, that's really all I'm hoping for. I mean, I'd love for. I mean, this is idyllic. I mean, oh man, if somebody sees himself in Simba's shoes and makes a better choice because they happen to have read my essay, that might be amazing. Sure. I doubt that will ever happen, but hopefully readers go back and they watch The Lion King. They're like, oh, either they see it or they're like, yeah, that guy was a crackpot. That's not there at all. But hopefully, if I did this right, like it is there, and they see more deeply into the thing itself.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, so I certainly want to encourage anyone who's watching to please make sure that you grab a copy of the volume. As Josh said, Disney and Apologetics. I'll have the link to the website of the book where you can go and purchase it. It's also available on Amazon. Also, in the notes, I'll include a link to Josh's podcast. I encourage you to check it out. He dropped an episode this morning, at least at the time we're recording. And so certainly want to encourage you to check that out. And Josh, thanks again for joining me. I appreciate you taking the time.
So glad to do this, Miguel. It's always fun to chat.
Likewise. Thanks a lot.
Okay.